I'm not the house of cards that falls down easily. Oh, I'm strong enough to handle what you throw at me.
Welcome to Mental Health News Radio. I'm your host, Kristen Sunanta Walker. Just what are we going to discuss? The intimacy that is mental health. Let's continue to make it as comfortable as discussing brain health or heart health. This show has been on the air for several years and we have amazing co-hosts. And then we created a network of podcasters on mentalhealthnewsradionetwork.com, a place where every possible facet of mental well-being can be talked about openly. My show, after several hundred interviews, the format is this: intimate, deep, funny, touching, sometimes uncomfortable, but always vulnerable conversations with interesting people. The goal is to have you, our listening family, many of you who have become my good friends, feel as though you are listening in on private conversations. Thank you for tuning in and becoming part of this amazing journey with me, and now with our network of podcasters. Just knowing this podcast might be helping any of you realize you are not alone on this journey called being a human being makes doing this podcast worth every second.
After all, we promised we'd be cordial.
This is Kristen Walker, your host of Mental Health News Radio and CEO of Everything EHR. One of our most popular guests, Stephen Welch, is here again to discuss the topic of colorism. Colorism is defined as prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the same ethnic or racial group. This is a highly charged topic, especially in today's news, but it is a global and long-standing issue. Stephen is a seasoned psychotherapist with over 27 years of experience in the areas of addiction, HIV, LGBT, adult, and adolescent care. As a licensed clinical social worker and credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor, he is able to adapt his clinical knowledge to support clients in a wide spectrum of life stressors. He combines his multicultural experience as an African American, British Caribbean, living in New York City, and we are so pleased he is joining us yet again on Mental Health News Radio.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I know we touched on the topic we're going to talk about today, but we never, we went off topic and had so many great things to talk about. We didn't get to the meat of this like we wanted to. So please let our audience know what you wanted to talk about today.
Okay, so the topic today is the topic of colorism. And for those that are not familiar with the term, it was actually coined by Alice Walker, the author, in 1982. And it's looking at and deconstructing how color and complexion impacts mental wellness and how it's manifested in our society.
Alice Walker is my favorite author. She's been coming up a lot this week, so I had no idea that came from her. So I'm even more interested in talking about this topic.
Yes.
So tell me, what do we need to know about colorism, or you need to know as a mental health practitioner?
Sure. Well, first of all, colorism is a social and economic construct that provides privilege based on skin color. So, for example, the lighter your skin, the more privileges and access you have. The darker your skin, the less privilege or access to resources that you have. And the outgrowth of this, we can trace back to the slave trade and slavery, where African women were sexually assaulted or had children by the slave owners or the slave masters or just the white Europeans at the time. And those offspring were usually lighter than the darker-skinned Africans that came along. And a stratification by the plantation owners began to occur where the lighter-skinned offspring might be given less harsh work, have them work inside the house, while the darker slaves may work in the fields. And so it was a social construct to establish a hierarchy of desirability and social value.
And they attributed trust to a lighter-skinned African than they did a darker-skinned African.
Yes.
Interesting. What are some examples of colorism that we've seen in the media?
Well, in the media, we may have things such as, let's say they're models. Let's use models, for example. A lot of times, models of color will not be used or not be used as much as lighter skin or European models because of a sense that they may not sell as well around the world, or just prefer having clothes on a European or lighter-skinned woman. Look at our first African-American Miss America was a very light-skinned woman. This is not a put down on Vanessa Williams at all. It's just that usually when a color barrier is crossed, usually a lighter-skinned person will be more accepted first by the wider community. Also, if you look at certain ads or print ads, you might see if you're looking at a family or a couple, you'll see maybe a darker complected man with a lighter complected woman in that ad, a print ad in a magazine or newspaper. That's a couple of examples.
So what degree of color within a family or community impacts their self-identity?
Well, I think one of the questions is if you have a client, for example, who is a client of color, and mind you, I'm talking about any client of color, where there are color variations in families or in communities, is to explore with that client how color may or may not have impacted how they see themselves. So, for example, in a family where there are kids of various shades, within a family, there could be a sense of prioritizing or preferring the lighter-skinned child as prettier or as smarter. Sometimes it's actually in the reverse, where there's a lot of teasing of the lighter-skinned child or adult, and there's a preference for the darker person in a way to say this person is more authentic because they're dark. And so there's also that dynamic. But in terms of how colorism is used, not only how it's manifested in our country, but even around the world, the construct leans towards privilege to the lighter person, less privilege for the darker skinned person.
What are some of the ways in which, and I know this isn't part of your list of questions, but this just came in my head after reading some of my own material about this, what are some of the ways in which people have done harm to themselves, significant physical damage, using products or strange, configurations of different things to make their skin lighter? What are some of the things that you've heard about that people use to make that happen or to try to fit in those things?
Yeah, I can't specifically identify a specific product. However, I know some of the products contain mercury, and especially the products that are made outside of the U.S. And mercury is very toxic to the skin and can really tear at the skin. So there are skin lightening products, or what they call fade creams, and some individuals are actually using it to actually change the complexion of their skin. So you have in India, I think it's called Light and Lovely, which is one of the highest selling products in India, and it definitely is promoting a lighter skin is the equivalent to beauty and lovely. And you're more attractive, you're more likely to get married. So Light and Lovely, I believe, is the name of one product.
So while many of us are out there trying to bake ourselves in the sun, you've got the opposite problem going on.
Absolutely. And that's an interesting point because I think until 1920s, maybe a little before that, the idea of tanning was to show that health, that you've been in the sun or that you've traveled abroad. And so it was a nice image or an indication that this person is very healthy. Lighter complexion was seen by some Europeans as sickly or pasty, and so therefore to have some brown to their skin was considered healthy. In Japan, for example, which predates European contact, and I talked about the slave trade before, but predating the slave trade in Japan, they also practiced colorism, and that was a class distinction. So, for example, if you work in the fields, you automatically become darker. If you are of the ruling classes and indoors in homes, you would be of a lighter complexion. So the complexion got linked to class. Not that there's an intrinsic difference in terms of the darker person being less human. It was more they're of a lower class because they work in the fields. And that difference, as well as India, by the way, prior to the Europeans coming to India, they had their caste system, and a lot of that is also correlated to lighter complexion and darker complexion in being more valued or not. And it's not as stark as, let's say, in our culture, but it does follow value being lighter and less value being darker.
Well, if you look at the Japanese symbol of beauty, you're looking at geisha, and they are the white makeup. And that's where I had read so much about the damage that these women did, the toxins that they absorbed from the creams that they were using to make that happen.
Yes. Yes.
So
I mean, if you look... Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, keep going.
Well, I'm just going to point out how various even public people, like the baseball player Sammy Sosa was a very dark complected person and went through some type of treatment, and now he's very, very fair, even with green contact lenses. So, which speaks also to the Latin experience, where there's also a very strong stratification of skin color, or wanting to lighten the race is a very common term. So it's very prevalent in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, of course here, and a lot of that is due to the privilege of a European or approximating the aesthetics. So the aesthetics of the European being a lighter complexion, maybe straighter hair, a thinner nose, smaller lips. So even those features and skin color were prized or are prized in some kind of way. And so that can impact the self-esteem of someone who is darker, who has kinky or curlier hair or fuller lips. They can feel that they are not accepted or not as attractive, and therefore it impacts the self-esteem.
So one of the questions that you had for me was the connection between colonialism and colorism.
Yeah, I think that relates to the last piece that I mentioned. And there's a consistent pattern of, when European colonists went to places like Australia or the Caribbean, where there may have been Aboriginal tribes that already existed in those countries, or with the slave trade, let's say in the Caribbean, there is a consistent pattern of stratifying those either indigenous people or the slaves, that if they're of a lighter complexion, they were given certain privileges, or it was a way of also a divide and conquer of the people whose lands they were taking over. So if you create dissension amongst the people themselves, then the population is going to be easier to control. So what you have is multiple generations of people feeling like, well, my dark skin is ugly, or my lighter complexion makes me better. And there are assumptions that people feel that way, whether it's true or not for that person, but there's an assumption. So a person can walk into a room of a lighter complexion with a room of other African Americans or people of the African diaspora, and make assumptions about that person just based on their skin complexion. So all this is the heritage or the remnants of European colonization on persons of color, and then how that then impacts how they see themselves because of that historical trauma, let's say.
So do you think, and this, I find this part fascinating, do you think that the introduction of this was, it did not exist prior to colonialism? It was introduced by the very people that were going to capture slaves for, the various reasons that landowners and property owners in different European countries and the United States were doing this. Do you think that infection, which is what I see it as, was started by the people that were going after slaves, or that it already existed among the people in Aboriginal countries or Africa?
Well, based on my research and based on what I've read and documentaries I've watched, it's primarily a product of European contact. And places like, I think I mentioned Japan and India, where they already had a colorism practice. Also, like the Middle East, there was already that practice prior to the Europeans. But pretty much everywhere else, it was promoted by the colonists, the slave trade, and then it became sort of inherited by then the Aboriginal, the slaves. They then perpetuated that. But I did not hear of that practice being prevalent in, let's say, Africa.
Right.
At least in the past. I think once you get Western television, newspapers, magazines,
right,
then you begin to see that stratification begin to happen amongst people of color. And when you look at South Africa, their whole political and economic system was based on skin color and categorization of people.
I would find it fascinating to know that, if this, obviously this was introduced to cultures that didn't have this issue prior, and if the people that were introducing it knew that if they planted this seed, that it would be an easier way to triangulate and to defeat and conquer who they were trying to conquer.
Right.
It'd be interesting to study the psychology around that.
I'm sorry, repeat that?
I just was thinking what an interesting study of psychology around that if people knew that they were doing that. I mean, you've seen several other, Nazi Germany, where, certain psychological imprints were made on purpose to cause dissension among the Jewish population. So I wonder if, that was also a planned, a toxic seed to plant with these people, because it would make it easier to capture them and dominate them.
Well, absolutely. Creating dissension within people is a classic way of a divide and conquer approach. And also, when you think of some of the Jewish experience, and I am not an authority at all, but if your appearance was more European, you would actually have to identify yourself as Jewish. And some people would pass, if I can use that language, as quote-unquote non-Jew in order to survive. That some people would actually do that, as well as, let's say, in the African-American experience, where those that were lighter based on, mixing throughout generations and could pass for white in order to get a particular job or to move through the country freely. And sometimes within families, they find out years later or generations later that their grandfather or their grandmother was actually an African-American person. Now, mind you, when I'm saying all of this, I'm coming from a place of a construct, which means what we're talking about actually doesn't really exist. It's that it was put in place and organized and politicized, meaning there are laws against, African Americans being able to go certain places or even intermarry with the white population. Those were laws that were put in place. So the construct was supported by the political and economic and religious structures.
Right.
Yeah.
So bringing this back to today, and I do want to point out actually that a really great movie that shows this perfectly is The Cotton Club. That's a favorite from a long time ago. Well, not a long time ago, but what a depiction in that film of exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. And even when you look at Harlem, a lot of those stores on, let's say, 125th Street, we're moving it more into the 20th century. A lot of times when those stores that were owned by predominantly white people, they would hire lighter-skinned blacks to be at the front desk or behind the counter. If they were going to have somebody of color, it would be a light-skinned person.
Right, exactly. So as you're, working with clients, what is it that you see they believe are automatic thoughts from people when they see a very dark-skinned black man?
Yeah, now that particular question was geared towards just individuals, let's say just clinicians, let's say. I'm just going to use that population. If you're a clinician, a counselor, therapist, was what are your automatic thoughts around color? Mm-hmm. So if I'm a black therapist or African American therapist, and I have issues of skin color from my family because maybe I'm a lighter complexion person, so I was made more prominent, made to feel handsome, made to feel more intelligent, I may have an issue if I'm working with a client who is of a darker complexion, and vice versa. Or there could be no issue. But a lot of times that clinicians, especially those who are not of the African diaspora, may make, and I'm speaking of a European maybe extraction or some other part of the world, may perceive someone with dark skin as scary or frightening or even as very sexual or have sexual prowess when you talk about the black man, which are really echoes of perceiving the person as non-human, which
right.
the slaves were viewed as non-human. So it's a kind of an echo of that.
Where do you think that comes from, that particular piece that you just mentioned?
Well, I think it comes from multiple places. I think it comes from our language. You know, if you look at a witch is dressed in black, which is evil. Right. When the term the boogeyman was originally denoted as a black man. So the black man will take you away, or the black man will snatch your white children or your white wife. So the boogeyman was a black person of danger. Usually when we use the term black, it's associated with something negative or scary. Right. So the African becomes the embodiment of that to keep them in line, and for the rest of the community or the culture to perceive them as less than. So therefore, they don't have certain rights. So there's certain ways you perceive them. And so, you know, moving into our current times, there's been studies that reflect that white police officers or even white individuals can perceive a black youth, let's say a black male who may be 12, because they're of a darker complexion, can actually perceive them as older than they are. just based on their complexion.
Right. I mean, there's certainly much going on in the news about that right now. Absolutely.
Sure.
But, it's interesting. I witnessed this myself many years ago. I lived in a very small town in Oklahoma, and I was working for a dental practice. And one of my greatest friends there was African American, and he had joked to me. No one in that office. Everyone was there. Everyone there was a white person, and the fact that they even hired my friend, I won't say his name, of course, they would tout this as how open and how, they went on and on about how wonderful and terrific they were because they hired him, which made me sick because I moved from Southern California where, that just was a non-issue. I didn't even know what racism was until I was much older because it just was a non-issue where I grew up. So I always found that fascinating. And there were definitely many times where he would come in and he had to be very careful about which offices he stepped into, because if there was a female patient or one of the female dentists working in that room, he would ask me to come into the room with him. And my ignorance, because I did not grow up with this, I really didn't know what that was about until he sat down with me one night and said, "Look, girl, you need an education." I had no idea, he wasn't angry with me, but he just said, "There are some things, that you need to know, especially if you're going to be living in these rural southern areas." And it was sad, definitely extremely sad. And was part of the reason I stopped working there. I just couldn't take it anymore after that.
Yeah. I think that's a great example, especially when we're talking about mental wellness, how stressful that must have been for him. And that is the experience for a lot of people of color, that they have to kind of not only walk into a room, but also have a sense of alertness about how they might be being perceived, or how they may speak up in a meeting, or how they may articulate a certain point of view, because there's an automatic sense that this person is potentially dangerous, or this person can potentially be somehow out of control, or somehow want to take over, or want to take out the white women. It's a fear that's been built into our culture, and I'll just keep it to the American culture, that is just part of our psyche. Our country's richness was based on a huge part on the slave trade. So in order to make that a durable system, you have to create some kind of construct so that we can all kind of feel this is okay. We're getting all these resources and coal and cotton and various things being picked, but we have to perceive them as non-human or less than human, because we're putting them in inhuman conditions. But that's their lot. That's where they're supposed to be. And then you have religious verses, or in the name of a particular religion, may back that up.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. In the name of religion, doing that as well. I mean, it gives you the ability to be completely apathetic.
Absolutely.
Allow these behaviors to continue, because, my God, if you actually looked at the horror and the atrocity of it, how could you live with yourself and live in that society that supports this behavior?
Right. So in order to live with it, especially if you have, let's say, Christian values or a religious dogma that you follow, in order to make that acceptable, you have to develop a certain level of apathy about what is going on. So if you imagine generations and generations and generations of this apathy, what you end up getting is the shooting in the Carolinas, where there's just a sense of these lives do not matter. They're just not that important. And with the African American experience, that is the historical trauma of that people, and it was a system in place. Maybe it was a system in place for hundreds of years. So not only do you have the wider culture having a certain view of the people of color themselves look at themselves through a similar lens. So, for example, someone like myself, if you see a picture of me online, I'm a darker complected man. And so for some people, looking at me could feel quite threatened just by my physical presence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of our cultural legacy, actually, because I think you made the example of the radioactivity. Somebody described it as the radioactive fallout. We all got touched by the fallout, every one of us.
Right, exactly. And I, as an empathic and empathetic person, I'm always naturally trying to understand what someone else is feeling, putting myself in their shoes. And there are many people, of course, out there. My favorite topic to discuss is narcissism. So there are many people out there that are incapable of putting themselves in other people's shoes. But I think the way that I can relate is as a female, the ways where I've walked into a room and I have certainly felt like I better not talk, I shouldn't be there, I have a harder road to travel towards being respected, all of those things.
There's more for you to prove, or you feel that you have to prove yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yes, it's always interesting to me. And what trauma, my God, the trauma that everyone is experiencing right now with what has been going on lately.
Right.
I can't
and so all of this are, for me, from my perspective, are remnants of our slave history. It's part of those ripple effects that are still happening. And even though you may look at a president of color and feel, well, we've arrived, but we really haven't. That's very symbolic of a certain level of growth. But the issues that we're talking about are not, you don't legislate them away. They're part of the table talk, your kitchen talk, is the talk at the bar, is that kind of banter where all this begins to get expressed and maintained. So from a mental wellness point of view, one of the things that I would definitely like to come out of this discussion is that if you have a client and it's a client of color, to explore with that client, was color a factor in their family? Do they feel comfortable with their complexion? Were their differences created or talked about within the family? Did they experience themselves in their job site as somehow targeted because of their skin color? And those things impact self-esteem, your identity. It's stressful. It creates anxiety. Some folks have trauma connected to their skin color, somebody being called blackie or tar baby, that type of language, or other language that might be used now in today's world. But there's a connection between their color and somehow not being as good or feeling better than just based on skin color. There's a nursery rhyme from back in the day. If I say it correctly, it's if you're white, you're right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're black, stay back. And that was a nursery rhyme that came out through the African American experience. That was, it was a nursery rhyme. But when you think of it, that's a great example of the color stratification and how people perceive gradations of color.
Right. Absolutely. And how there's so many of those old nursery rhymes where you don't think about it when you're a child and you're singing it, and as an adult you look back when you're getting ready to sing to your own children. I know I did this with many, many, many of the nursery rhymes that my grandmother sang to me, and I just loved to lay there and listen to her, and I turned around with my son to sing them to him, and it hit me what I was singing.
Exactly.
And that when you're a kid, you have no idea, and how much that's implanting a message into your head when you're hearing those songs as a child.
Absolutely. And that's another great example of how it gets inculcated into the mind of the human being.
Right. And as you come into therapy and you're presenting problems, you don't even realize until you start peeling back the layers where things are originating from.
Exactly. And so as clinicians, I'm bringing out this topic so that clinicians can begin to add another dimension of how they're assessing some of their clients, even clients who may not be persons of color, but their partner may be of another ethnic group and is darker or has a different hair texture, facial features, etc., and how their relationship can be stressed because of some of these differences, maybe not between them, but by the wider society making comments or generalizations about, let's say, their black husband or their Latina wife. And
even within their own families making these remarks as well.
Absolutely. It's very common in so many families of color. And I think, I don't remember which country I heard this from. The English translation was, or part of it was, you present yourself as white, but your grandmother is in the kitchen, meaning that the grandmother is black in the back.
Oh, interesting.
And the children or the grandchildren who are white due to, mixed marriage or just marrying lighter, those kids look white, but grandma's in the back.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, Stephen,
I hope somebody responds and actually gives the correct translation or responds with where that comes from. That would be great to add to your website.
I will Google it myself.
Wonderful.
And as usual, we've gone over time, but we always have lots to talk about. So, and one thing I want to ask you is, now I know Alice Walker was an incredible speaker and powerful in the feminist movement, as well as her heritage, and speaking about people of her same heritage, but are there any of her books that she wrote that specifically address openly the topic of colorism, where that word colorism is used?
It was something that she wrote, I think, in 1982. I don't recall the name of the article, but there are many other resources out there, such as I think it's going to be written on the blog. I think I put all the resources on there.
You did. We'll have them. We'll have them on the blog. Absolutely.
Sure. But I'd like to mention a few just to the listeners. There is a fantastic documentary called Dark Girls by Bill Duke and Mr. Berry, 2012, which talks about dark-skinned women and their experience in American culture, as well as a documentary called Black in Latin America, which was done in 2011 by Dr. Lewis Gates. Those are two excellent documentaries. School Days, the movie School Days by Spike Lee in 1988 is another good depiction of colorism. And The Color Complex, The Politics of Skin in the New Millennium, 2013 by Kathy Roselle, Cole, and Mitch Wilson, and Ronald E. Hall. That's another excellent resource. And additional resources will be online.
Right, exactly. I know, very contemporary story. It came out in 1998, but it's such a movie that was done with a contemporary style as The Wedding, starring Halle Berry.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
That was one I had seen, and at the time that I saw it, it reminded me of what I had experienced with my friend in Oklahoma. So that one hit home with me. So tell us, Stephen, how can other therapists and as well as patients reach out and be able to connect with you?
Sure, thank you. My contact number is 914-589-3168. That's 914-589-3168. My practice or office number, address, the number is the same as what I just gave you, but my address is 19 West 34th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, penthouse floor in New York. And you can get more information about me on psychologytoday.com. Just put my name, Stephen P as in Peter Welch, LCSW, and my profile will come up. Or you can Google that. Google my name, LCSW, and my profile will also come up.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Again, you're one of our most popular guests. So on a Friday night, I thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, listening audience.
Wonderful. And to our listeners, thank you again for joining us on another edition of Mental Health News Radio.
Hi, listeners. I'll make it quick. These are some really cool places that give discounts and other cool things for listeners of Mental Health News Radio Network. If you want to get amazing help with healing from narcissistic abuse, go to healfromanarcissist.com. If you want CBD products that are the best of the best, I use them myself, go to Proze, PROZE.com, and use the code mentalhealth20, mentalhealth20. If you want to get daily perk ups that help retrain your brain to think more positively, go to perkupdaily.com. And also, just because this one's fun, snarkycandles.com. I guarantee you'll love them. Snarky with a Y, SNARKY, candles.com. And don't forget, if you want to hear all the shows on the network about first responders, you can go to firstrespondermentalhealthnetwork.com, and all of our shows that focus on narcissistic abuse, narcissisticabusehealingnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, and back to the show.
Sometimes I'm passive-aggressive, but never without good intentions. I heat up and act on my emotions.
Thanks so much for listening to Mental Health News Radio. Our podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and hundreds of other podcast apps, or you can visit our website at mentalhealthnewsradio.com. If you have a question or would like to be a guest, become a podcaster on our network, or join the amazing organizations that help keep us on the air, please email us at info@mhnrnetwork.com. Get ready for that special goodbye from our resident therapy dog, Miles, and a special thanks to Emily Sohn for letting us use her incredible song, Cordial, for our podcast music. Listen to the full song on SoundCloud at emily.sonne.
Don't be surprised when I don't hate on you. After all, we promised we'd be cordial. Sometimes in you I can fight it, but how opposing.
Good boy.